Joining me now is Daniel Levin, board member of the Liechtenstein Foundation for State Governance. He's been an advisor to governments around the world. Daniel, give me your sense of how this thing plays out, because you don't normally see major executives of major corporations nabbed at an airport. Normally these things end up with a slap on the wrist, with fines, and a lot of times the fines are directed at the company and not the individual, right?
Yeah, this is really unusual. There's not a lot of precedent of going after individual executives rather than after the companies. I mean, if you wanted to go back to the global financial crisis of 2008, if you started to arrest executives involved with malfeasance or alleged malfeasance, you'd have Wall Street, the lights would be out, it'd be a ghost town. So imagine for a moment if, let's say, Malaysia used the opportunity of the World Economic Forum and asked the Swiss government or the Swiss authorities to arrest Goldman Sachs senior executives who show up in Davos for their role in the 1MDB scandal. You'd have an outcry here. So this is really unusual and obviously part of a political negotiation between the U.S. and China on the trade issues.
And that's one piece of it. The other piece is that she's accused of skirting the Iran sanctions. And yet, what about people in China who might say, wait a minute, the U.S. ignores international agreements all the time? I mean, they were a signatory to the Iran nuclear deal. They walked away from the Paris climate deal. They might see this as hypocrisy.
Yeah, well, take a step back. First of all, China and Iran are probably the easiest vote getters in U.S. domestic politics. So this is a double whammy because she's accused of this whole Skycom issue as it relates to financial disclosures to HSBC on Iran. In fact, Iran provides quite a useful precedent for the president stepping in and rescinding or doing his part to have this extradition warrant rescinded. If you look back to 2015 with the Iran treaty, one of the things that happened was that in the Obama administration, extradition orders against 14 Iranian nationals who had been accused of far more severe violations of U.S. law had been rescinded as part of that treaty. So there is a political component to these extradition treaties, irrespective now of how countries treat their treaties. One little parenthesis on Iran, part of the problem you have here is that we're dealing with a violation of U.S. sanctions rather than UN sanctions. When China, being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, it would have a completely different dimension. So it's a little sidebar here to the problem.
Well, what's really at play? Because a lot of people are viewing this through the backdrop of the race for 5G technology. Some in China may say this is another example of the U.S. trying to contain China's rise.
Yeah, I think that there's certainly one element of it being the fact that in 2020 5G is going to get rolled out globally, and Huawei is one of the leading providers, and there's a competitive aspect to that. I think the larger picture, in fact, to me seems to be that you can't really negotiate trade and commercial issues as you can't military or political issues in isolation if your interests are simply not aligned. The better way to go forth for China and the U.S. would not to focus, let's say, on 5G or currency or trade imbalance issues or alleged theft of intellectual property, which is one of the reasons a meeting was canceled this week, a preparatory meeting in Washington with Chinese vice ministers. If you do these in isolations, you just can't reach an agreement. The better way to do that is to put the respective interests of each country on a scale and try to see how those items balance out so you can have more of a omnibus agreement. I think everyone can agree, or most people should agree, that a trade war is in nobody's interest here.
Let me ask you one final question. You advise governments all the time. What type of advice would you give to the Trudeau government? Because they're kind of caught in the middle between two very powerful countries. And the same for China and the United States. I mean, what's the best resolution here?
I think the best way, first of all, the methodology, before we get, the best resolution is to de-escalate this whole thing, whether this is just the case of Huawei CFO, Ms. Wang, or whether it's in any other context, is you obviously want to de-escalate it. But the methodology, which probably leads to the right outcome, is to take this whole negotiation and make it much more private. Stop with the public statements, whether they're through Twitter or otherwise. These formalized negotiations don't lead anywhere because the fronts are so hardened. The better way to do it is to go into more informal diplomacy and really put chips on the table with plausible deniability. So if you don't reach an agreement, as if these discussions hadn't taken place, but at least the parties there have a chance to really be creative in finding solutions. If you just focus on this issue alone, it's not going to lead to a good place. This has to be de-escalated in much more informal, intimate, and confidential conversations.
Daniel Levin with some great advice. Not sure everyone's going to listen to, but nevertheless, thanks so much for joining us from New York.